Welcome to the podcast for History and Theories of Psychology, brought to you by Victoria University, produced and presented by myself, Paul Duffett. This is the unit where we look at the historical context of psychology from the early 20th century right through to today.
It's one small step for man.
Shut up and sit down.
One giant leap for mankind.
And greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right.
Every 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
And welcome back. This is part 2 of our podcast for Teaching Week 4. And this week it's all about behaviorism. So let's continue where we left off in part 1. Behaviorism had an enormous appeal to the marketing industry because it promised the ability to manipulate the behavior of the consumer so that the individual would consume more of a manufacturer's goods. Now, more broadly, behaviourist principles were taken up in the commercial sector, but also in the public sector, this time in regards to controlling the workforce. Now, just as in the regards to the military, needing to train large numbers of military recruits in a short amount of time and train them to operate technically sophisticated machinery, this is true of factory employees as well. Employers needed to recruit and train large numbers of factory employees. They had to train them quickly, and they had to train them to adapt to fast developing technologies that were being used on production lines. And employers sought to train those employees cheaply in the quest to improve productivity. So this was the era of industrial relations, increased attention that was being placed on technologies that could both produce more goods, but also on technologies that could more effectively manage large numbers of employees that were working in these ever-expanding factories. So it was an era of growth for professions like human resource development and human resource departments. This is a profession that developed particularly during those years, 1920s, 30s and 40s and so on. And it was a profession that was and still is focused on combining training and organizational development and career development to encourage the improvement of individuals and groups to up rates of productivity. And the theory of behaviorism provided an important set of tools and an important theory in regards to developing models of training for employees. I want to give you another link, and this is a link to the economy and a link to the profession of economists in particular, because behaviorism had a great appeal to economists. The public in the early part of the 1900s, as they pretty much are today, were and are largely distrustful of economists, because economists were seen, particularly during the 1900s and 1920s, they were seen to have very crude models of human behavior, and politicians were distrusted for basing their policies on the work of economists. And behaviorism offered economists, but also politicians, a model of human economic activity that they could claim to be more sophisticated and scientifically grounded. And this is now known as the field of behavioral economics. Behavioral economics was popularized by a book called Nudge, written by Richard Taylor and Cass Sunstein. Again, I'll put a link up there in the podcast notes. And it was a book that was written by economists and became very influential with politicians. An example of that comes from my home country, the UK, where we have a thing called the Behavioural Insights Team. This was set up initially in Downing Street in the UK to work for government, and it now works independently of government but still advises government. And this unit's aim was to find, and still is, to find mechanisms to manipulate people so that they will do good things For example, save more money for retirement, invest in their superannuation, or eat less bad food, or take more exercise, or whatever the politicians think the people should do. And all of this is based on behaviourist principles. Now, Skinner would not have been displeased about this, the fact that his ideas were being picked up, not only by the commercial sector, but by the public sector and by politicians. In fact, he was convinced that his operant conditioning theories should be used by politicians, and he felt that behaviorism provided the model to completely reshape society in a good way. That was really what his book Walden 2 was all about. It was kind of like a political thesis in some ways. Now, to sum up, behaviorism was a theory that was attractive to both military and to corporations. It conceptualized people as objects that could be used to service the needs of war and the needs of society. Now, where human nature and people were constructed in such a reductionist way, effectively they were just, in J.B. Watson's words, just equivalent of animals or brutes. They just responded automatically to stimulus that you presented before them. It's perhaps no wonder that we saw some pretty dreadful things happening around that time. And you could make a conjecture here to war and World War II. Remember that World War II was the deadliest military conflict that's ever happened in human history in terms of the absolute total casualties suffered. It was 6 million people were killed. And that was around about 3% of the world population in the 1940s. So extraordinary atrocities created, and of course the extraordinary atrocities of the Holocaust. And you do wonder whether a psychology that took as its object of inquiry human behaviour, but reduced it to such a simplistic level that removed so much of what we now know of human experience from that object, essentially reduced it to the point where people could just be equated with either animals or machines, that it's no wonder that the object of study of psychology became dehumanized. And the theories of behaviorism worked well and fed well into systems that were perpetrating some of the most horrific abuses. So it was servicing the needs of the war industry, but also servicing the needs of the economy, the exploitation of the workers. Okay, so let's start moving towards the conclusion of this podcast. We've got through quite a bit of material here so far. Now, behaviorism showed a decline over the years, really starting by the 1970s. This was a time, it's not within our sights at this stage in the unit, because we're not really going much beyond 1940s. We're kind of stopping around about World War II, 1950s. If we looked ahead to the 1970s, what we would see would be a society that was starting to turn inwards into people's thoughts and feelings. This was the era of rampant individualism coming in the 1970s under neoliberalism. It was also the era that was a response to the 1960s as a concentration on people's emotional lives and a shift to a focus on the individual. Now, we'll consider all that a little later in our unit. For now, just another little clip, just showing you some of the... I just think it's a lovely little clip from a film that I absolutely adore, Inside Out. You see lots of references to Inside Out in these podcasts and lectures. It's a beautiful little film, and I've just given you a little edit that I'll put the link up on View Collaborate. And it's about the thoughts and feelings that are sitting inside the main character of the film, Riley's heads. The edit cut out all of those inner dialogues that are happening in Riley's heads so that you just see her behaviour, and you'll see that the result is a little bit weird. So this video is about 15 minutes long. So I'll have to let you watch it after this podcast. Now, what can we say that's similar and different about behaviorism and psychoanalysis? Well, there were some sort of similarities when you think about it. Both behaviorism and psychoanalysis hypothesized drives that were kind of hidden from us. For psychoanalysis, this was the id, things happening in our unconscious. For behaviorism, it was hidden from us because they were automatic. They were just conditioned reflexes. So all our thoughts and feelings kind of got dumped really by behaviorism, and so hidden in effect. So in some ways, but by different means, psychoanalysis and behaviorism made an awful lot of our subjective inquiry hidden. It couldn't be observed because it's in the unconscious, or it couldn't be observed because there's no point in looking at it. But there are important differences between psychoanalysis and behaviorism, and one important difference was the emphasis that was put on morality. And in psychoanalysis, morality was the forefront, because psychoanalysis was dealing with both emotions and drives, and the drives that psychoanalysis in the early days decided to reduce down to was sex and death and little else. But psychoanalysis also keyed into history and culture, and psychoanalysis was trying to make sense of how people adapted to the changing norms in society, and particularly norms around morality. What was good behavior, what was bad behavior, how we could exist successfully within the model codes of the society in which we lived. So morality was really center stage for psychoanalysis. It was that constant wrestle that we had between our desires and morality, about doing the good thing and being a good citizen and behaving in a morally appropriate way. Behaviorism cut loose from all of that stuff, and largely morality and issues around ethics became abandoned. Behaviorism also produced this model of behavior as ultimately malleable, and delivered to us this theory of human nature. It's kind of like people being pigeon-brained. We're just a little bit dumb, and we just respond automatically to stimulus in the environment, and that we're easily controlled. This didn't sit very well with the public. Once the public started to understand the sort of ideas that were sitting behind behaviorism, that were informing the models being used by psychology, but also some of the models that were being adopted by the corporations and by politicians, public didn't really like this way that we were thinking of human behavior. And nowadays, behaviorism has fallen so far out of favour, not just in the public's mind, but in the mind of psychologists as well. Now we've got minds. That behaviorism is kind of treated as a bit of a joke. Now, this could be a little unfair. Now, when you kind of think about some of the things that behaviorism did, it was very crude. It was a very dehumanizing approach to human nature. Well, that's what I would argue. Not everyone would argue that, but I would argue that. One thing it did draw attention to was the importance of the environment. And in the turn away from behaviorism, the importance of the environment impacting on our behavior has kind of got lost. And psychologists started to focus more and more of their attention of what was going on inside our heads. And we kind of started to lose the focus of the place in which our heads were in. And we'll talk about that when we get to critical psychology later on in this unit. Now, why this is important is because there's this link with the treatment of mental illness that you may take on in your essay. And here, in some ways, behaviorism did offer a counterpoint to the growth in the notion of this idea of mental illness. And in particular, in regards to this notion that mental illness was something that existed and could be treated with drugs. To the behaviorist, the concept of mental illness was wildly unscientific because it was making reference to internal states of the mind, and behaviorism rejected any inquiry into that subject matter. Essentially, the critique of the behaviorist was that the concept of mental illness was not empirically grounded because you couldn't directly observe it, and also the concept of mental illness ignored the impact of the environment. That actually people behaved in a disturbed way because of things that were happening in their environment. That it was purely behavior that was learnt by things happening around the individual. And behaviorists cited how behavioral interventions were far better than drug treatments because you just change the environment and it'll change the behavior. And behaviorists looked for the causes of distress in that environment, and they said there's no point in looking for causes of behavioral disturbance in the brain, look for in the environment. There was a moment where psychology could have taken a direction away from the direction we've taken now, but behaviorism got dumped, and that opportunity to focus in on the environment and away from the brain kind of got lost at that point. So there's a connection there you could make in terms of one of the tasks you have is to think of how we've ended up with this concept of mental illness, and we're treating people for mental illness, and now it's incredibly controversial. Some people say it's a brain disease, other people say there's nothing wrong with people's brains, it's all environmental. Behaviorism might have led us to expect that the concept of mental illness might have been challenged more than it has been in recent years. But as with psychoanalysis, behaviorism survived. Not really so much in psychology, though its legacy is still with us with the obsession we have with the laboratory experiment. But behaviorist principles became embedded in some of our political systems and into our culture through the activities of industry and the commercial sector. The biggest legacy of behaviorism for psychology really was the embedding of the positivist paradigm into the discipline. So what happened in the 1970s, psychology dropped behaviorism, but it didn't drop this preoccupation with the scientific method that behaviorism put at the fore. And we can make some connections back to previous materials we've looked at in regards to the bridging between medicine and psychology. And we have seen psychology reaching over to medicine to try and make connections, but in doing so, kind of being sucked down into this scientific vacuum. Some of the harshest critics of psychology say that psychology is now in a place where its scientific basis has very weak foundations, and it might be stemming from that time where a particular paradigm got embedded in psychology and took hold in psychology that limited the development of the field in terms of the development of the field as a scientific enterprise. So remember, in psychoanalysis, there were lots of scientific paradigms available for people to base their methods of inquiry on. These largely got wiped out under behaviorism. They still survived and existed, and they served as a form of critiquing behaviorism. So they didn't get wiped out completely, but they experienced considerable marginalization during the time of behaviorism. Remember when psychology was first founded, 1879, qualitative forms of inquiry were seen as important as quantitative, so the methods of introspection, projective techniques, interpretive techniques, and so on were seen as valuable. By the time behaviorism finished with psychology, those methods of inquiry were pretty well obliterated from our discipline. We're still struggling to get some of that back and to rebalance the science that is adopted by our profession, even now in the 21st century. Now, behaviorism firmly placed psychology into a positivist scientific paradigm. And when psychology dropped behaviorism, it didn't drop the aim to make psychology a positivist science. And it remained focused on experiments conducted in laboratories as its main method of inquiry. But these alternative social science paradigms in general, and qualitative research in particular, were ubiquitous in psychology. They played such an important role throughout psychology's early history. So an effect of behaviorism appears to be a wiping out of that history. It's as though it's created an impermeable boundary around the discipline. And so people are no longer able to see that psychology began grounded in both quantitative and qualitative research. So the qualitative tradition and the paradigms of interpretivism, social constructionism, and critical theory played an important part in psychology's history. They were paradigms available and picked up by psychoanalysis, but they're also paradigms that were available prior to psychoanalysis. In the early days, what is seen as the founding of psychology in 1879, qualitative inquiry was being conducted by Wilhelm Wundt and by William James. They were using these forms of inquiries because they had scientific status, because qualitative work gave credibility to their work. But during this early part of the 20th century, qualitative research was effectively written out of the history of psychology. And it's only since the weakening dominance of behaviorism have we started to see work that's grounded in these alternative scientific paradigms coming back to the fore, though they still sit in a rather marginalized position in psychology. So qualitative research still sits a little marginalized in psychology as a profession, though it's not as bad as it was. So psychology has borrowed heavily from the biological sciences, and one way of characterizing this is that psychology, particularly in the early 20th century, at its crudest, borrowed the language and practice of the mainstream biological sciences, and it kind of shoehorned them into an investigation into human experience and behavior in an attempt to gain some scientific respectability and esteem. Arguably, psychology was seeking to pass itself off as a paramedical science, and it sought to tap into medical and biological science research budgets, which are, by the way, considerably larger than the budgets available to the social sciences. Behaviorism was part of that tradition. It was borrowing a scientific paradigm that was of growing dominance in the biological and medical sciences, and it was adopting it into psychology. Now, Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winner for physics, described this as making psychology into a cargo cult science. This refers to what was happening in the Second World War, where the South Sea Islanders were seeing cargo planes flying over full of goods, and these cargo planes were landing at local airstrips, and the goods were then distributed to the armed forces, but also distributed to the population as well, to ease the war efforts and to compensate the local citizens caught up in it. Now, after the war was over, the planes stopped landing and the runways closed down. So some South Sea Islanders started building fake airstrips. They would mark out runways in the ground, and they would put fires along the sides of the runways, and they'd make wooden huts for someone to sit in to look like a control tower. And they would wait for the airplanes to land. They were doing everything right. The form was perfect. It was a perfect simulation of a runway, and it looked exactly the way it looked before when the planes used to land. But it didn't work. No planes landed. And Richard Feynman uses this as a metaphor for psychology, because psychology was following all of the apparent precepts and forms of scientific investigation, but they were missing something essential because the planes didn't land. And in this analogy, the planes you can think of as a theory of mind that has resonance and truth and value. Okay, so now how can you connect all of this to those contemporary practices we're focusing in on Essay 1? Well, we've picked up a couple of ways of doing this. There's one more explicit link. Well, during the 60s, Skinner's theories started to get challenged by new psychologists coming into the profession. And one experiment that was run was an experiment where shocks were inflicted on a dog. You know, it's pretty horrible what psychologists used to do to dogs and other animals and human beings. But these dogs were shocked in behavioral training programs, and one of the psychologists who was doing this was Dr. Martin Seligman. He and his colleagues found through the experiments that dogs failed to learn to avoid the shock, and they didn't follow the theories of behaviorism that you'd predict that the dog would always want to avoid the shock, but the dog just gave up and just accepted the shocks, and they laid pitifully on the bottom of their cage just waiting for the next electric shock to hit them. And Seligman and his colleagues concluded that the animals had been conditioned into such impotency through what they called learned helplessness. So this was a bit of a critique and a challenge to behaviorist theory. It was suggesting that things were a little bit more complicated than behaviorism was saying, but it was still underlying it with some behavioral theory, and also they acquired this understanding through laboratory experiments using animals. The theory was later transposed onto human behavior as a new model of explaining depression as a form of learned helplessness. And this notion of learned helplessness then bore a intervention, which is known as positive psychology, and the concept of resilience, that we need to build up people's resilience and get people to think positively about their worlds in ways that they could help them escape their learned helplessness and their depression. Now, if you've read the Hoffman Report in the second teaching week that informed our discussion in that second week seminar, you'll have seen how Dr. Seligman became embroiled in the crisis over psychologists being involved in torture. The Department of Defense had used Seligman's studies to refine methods of breaking a detainee's will in the War on Terror. Seligman later acknowledged that he spoke for 3 hours to Navy personnel at a Navy base in San Diego in the spring of 2002. And he spoke there with about a dozen Navy and CIA officials. But he says that he was talking to them about how you could use his work to help American soldiers resist torture, not to inflict it. But it became embroiled in the controversy nonetheless. So there are links there between behaviorism and torture, and also behaviorism and mental illness, and these new treatment models built on theories that came from behaviorist experiments, i.e. positive psychology, resilience training, all coming from these notions of learned helplessness. Okay, that concludes today's podcast. So lots of material, bit of a long one, and there's plenty of material there, I think, that we can engage with for the seminar. And just to finish off on a cheery little spot, I play Inside Out, favourite film. I'm not going to say whether the programme, The Big Bang Theory, is one of my favourites or not. I'm going to keep that private. But it's useful because it's popular culture these days. Quite a popular show. And this is just one showing how those behaviourist principles sit deeply in the way we think about things. We have acquired some of those notions of behaviour response and conditioning in our everyday talk. Okay, enjoy the clip. So just the clip will be available by a YouTube link in the podcast notes, and I shall see you very soon.